The tassel on Daniel's mortarboard caught the June sunlight as he posed for photos with our parents on the steps of Harvard Law School, their faces glowing with the kind of pride reserved for moments when family expectations align perfectly with reality. I stood at the edge of the celebration, my community college associate degree feeling like a participation trophy compared to my brother's Juris Doctorate, when his laughter suddenly cut through the congratulatory conversations surrounding us. "You're worried about Isabella's future?" Daniel said to our cousin Marcus, his voice carrying across the crowd with the casual cruelty that had defined our relationship for 24 years. "He'll never have a future. He'll always be dead weight. Some people are just born to struggle while others are meant for greatness." The misgendering was deliberate. Daniel had never accepted my transition, treating my identity as another failure to add to his catalog of my inadequacies. But it was the phrase "dead weight" that hit like a physical blow, reducing my entire existence to a burden that the successful Morrison family had to carry, despite my obvious unworthiness. The laughter that followed his words created a circle of complicity around me. Relatives who'd watched this dynamic play out for decades, family friends who knew better than to challenge the golden child's assessment of his defective sister, and my parents, who studied their champagne glasses rather than defend their daughter from public humiliation. I swallowed hard, my heart fracturing into pieces that felt too sharp to ever heal properly, but I remained silent. Speaking up would only provide more ammunition for Daniel's entertainment, more evidence that I was too sensitive for the real world, too emotional to handle the kind of casual dismissal that he believed I deserved. "Isabella's just different," Mom said weakly, her voice carrying the apologetic tone she'd perfected over the years when explaining my existence to people who mattered. "She's very artistic, very creative. Not everyone needs to follow traditional paths to success." But Daniel wasn't finished. He was riding the high of his academic achievement and the adoration of everyone present, drunk on the kind of validation that made cruelty feel like entertainment rather than abuse. "Different is a kind way to put it," he continued, straightening his honor cord with the satisfaction of someone who'd never faced a challenge he couldn't overcome through intelligence and charm. "Let's be honest, Isabella's learning disabilities aren't going anywhere. She'll be living in our parents' basement when she's 40, still trying to figure out how to balance a checkbook." The crowd's uncomfortable laughter was more devastating than outright mockery would have been. These people weren't cruel by nature, but they were too invested in maintaining social harmony to challenge Daniel's assessment or defend someone who'd been designated as the family failure. I felt tears threatening behind my eyes, but refused to give Daniel the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Instead, I excused myself to the bathroom, where I spent 10 minutes gripping the marble sink while trying to remember the self-worth affirmations my therapist had taught me for moments exactly like this one. When I emerged, the celebration had moved to dinner at an exclusive restaurant where I sat quietly at the end of the table, listening to toasts about Daniel's brilliant future, while my own dreams felt increasingly impossible to imagine. Every accomplishment he'd achieved, Harvard acceptance, law review, prestigious job offers, was another reminder of the paths that remained closed to someone with my cognitive processing differences. The drive home was silent, except for my parents discussing Daniel's job prospects and potential career trajectories, as if his success was the family's primary source of meaning, and my presence was simply tolerated rather than valued. 14 years would pass before I saw Daniel again. 14 years during which I would transform from the learning disabled daughter who embarrassed the family into someone whose name appeared in golden letters on an office door that he would never have imagined I could earn. When he finally walked into my office yesterday, resume in hand, desperation replacing his usual arrogance, the man who'd once called me dead weight was begging for employment from the sister he'd systematically destroyed. The golden child who'd seemed destined for greatness had discovered that success built on other people's failures was as fragile as the cruel words that created it. But the conversation we were about to have would reveal secrets that made his graduation speech seem gentle compared to the devastating truths about our family that neither of us had been prepared to face. Growing up as the dyslexic daughter in the Morrison family was like being a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture everyone was trying to create. No matter how hard they tried to force me into place, my edges never aligned with their expectations of intellectual achievement and academic excellence. Our household revolved around test scores, honor rolls, and the kind of competitive academic performance that my learning differences made nearly impossible to achieve. Daniel was 2 years older and seemingly designed by genetics to fulfill every parental aspiration our mother and father had accumulated during their own frustrated academic careers. He read before kindergarten, solved math problems that challenged children twice his age, and displayed the kind of natural intellectual curiosity that made teachers call home to praise his exceptional abilities. I, meanwhile, struggled to recognize letters until I was 8, couldn't memorize multiplication tables despite hours of tutoring, and required reading assistance that my parents treated as both expensive and embarrassing. Every parent-teacher conference became an exercise in damage control, with explanations about how not all children develop at the same pace, delivered in tones that suggested patience was wearing thin. Daniel's academic gifts are truly exceptional, Mrs. Patterson told my parents during one of their regular conferences about his accelerated placement needs. You should consider early admission to gifted programs. He could easily graduate high school at 16 if you wanted to pursue that option. And Isabella? Dad asked, his voice carrying the obligatory concern of someone checking off a parental requirement rather than expressing genuine interest in my educational progress. Isabella is working very hard, Mrs. Patterson replied diplomatically. She has some challenges with traditional learning methods, but with continued support and perhaps some specialized tutoring, she should be able to manage grade-level expectations. The phrase manage grade-level expectations became code for acknowledging that I would never excel like Daniel, never bring pride to the family name, never justify the investment in my education that could have been better spent on his advanced opportunities. At home, the differences between us were impossible to ignore. Daniel completed homework in minutes while I struggled for hours. He absorbed information effortlessly while I required constant repetition, and he tested into honors programs while I needed accommodations just to pass regular classes. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became Mom's default response to my academic struggles, as if Daniel's success was a blueprint I was simply too stubborn to follow. "He puts in the effort and gets results. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time focusing, your grades would improve." But I was focusing, desperately, exhaustively, to the point where homework became nightly battles that left everyone frustrated and me feeling increasingly stupid despite evidence that suggested I was actually quite intelligent in ways that standardized tests couldn't measure. Daniel seemed to understand instinctively that his academic success required my failure as comparison. He developed sophisticated methods for highlighting my limitations while appearing supportive, creating situations where my struggles became entertainment for family gatherings. "Poor Isabella," he would say with practiced sympathy when relatives asked about our different academic paths. "She tries so hard, but some people just aren't built for intellectual work. I help her when I can, but you can't teach natural ability." The implication that my difficulties were caused by laziness rather than neurological differences became family doctrine, repeated so often that I began to believe I was choosing failure rather than facing challenges beyond my control. High school intensified the contrast between us. Daniel was valedictorian, National Merit Scholar, and accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship. I graduated with a C average and a community college acceptance letter that felt like public acknowledgement of my intellectual inadequacy. "At least Isabella has vocational options," Mom said when discussing our post-graduation plans with neighbors. "Not everyone needs college to have a meaningful life. Trade schools are perfectly respectable alternatives for children who aren't academically inclined." But I was academically inclined, just not in ways that traditional educational systems recognized or valued. My brain processed information differently, made connections that others missed, and solved problems through creative approaches that didn't fit standardized testing formats. The learning disability diagnosis didn't come until I was 19. Provided by community college counselors who recognized patterns that K-12 educators had missed or dismissed. Suddenly, my academic struggles had an explanation that didn't involve laziness, stupidity, or lack of effort. Dyslexia with processing differences, the educational psychologist explained after comprehensive testing. Isabella's intellectual capacity is actually above average, but traditional teaching methods don't accommodate her learning style. With proper support and alternative approaches, she could excel in many fields. The diagnosis was both validating and heartbreaking. Validation that my struggles weren't character flaws. Heartbreak that years of family disappointment had been based on misunderstanding rather than reality. But it was also too late to change the family dynamics that had positioned Daniel as the smart child and me as the disappointment who required constant management. By the time of Daniel's Harvard graduation, our roles were permanently established. He was the son who brought honor to the Morrison name, while I was the daughter whose existence required explaining to people who mattered. His success justified their parenting approach, while my struggles were evidence of genetic limitations that no amount of support could overcome. The dead weight comment at his graduation wasn't just cruelty. It was his public declaration that the family hierarchy would remain unchanged, regardless of any progress I might make. Daniel intended to keep me in the position of family failure, and he believed his Harvard degree gave him the authority to make that determination permanent. But what Daniel didn't understand was that being labeled as worthless had motivated me to prove that worth could be measured in ways he'd never considered. and that intelligence came in forms that his traditional academic success had never required him to develop. The morning after Daniel's graduation humiliation, I woke up in my childhood bedroom for the last time, surrounded by participation trophies and modified achievement certificates that suddenly felt like evidence of a life spent accepting other people's limitations rather than discovering my own potential. The shame from the previous day had crystallized into clarity. I needed to leave the Morrison family's sphere of influence to find out who I could become without their constant reminders of who I wasn't. I moved to Portland 3 weeks later, using money saved from part-time jobs to rent a studio apartment above a used bookstore where the owner, Mrs. Chen, offered me employment that came with built-in understanding about learning differences and alternative approaches to intelligence. Book smart isn't the only kind of smart, she told me during my interview, watching me struggle to fill out the application form with its tiny print and complex formatting. Some of the most successful people I know think in pictures instead of words, see patterns instead of details. That's a gift, not a deficit. Working at the bookstore became my education in recognizing intelligence that doesn't conform to academic standards. I met artists who couldn't balance checkbooks but created beauty that moved people to tears, entrepreneurs who dropped out of school but built successful businesses through intuition and creativity, and inventors whose dyslexia had taught them to visualize solutions that traditionally educated minds couldn't imagine. One customer, Jake Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, was a software developer who'd built a company around creating technology that accommodated different learning styles. His approach to business development was revolutionary. Instead of trying to fix people's cognitive differences, he designed systems that leverage those differences as strengths. Traditional business models assume everyone processes information the same way, he explained during one of our conversations about technology and accessibility. But neurodiversity is actually an advantage if you design systems that work with different cognitive styles rather than against them. Jake became my mentor in understanding how my learning differences could be assets rather than obstacles. He taught me to recognize patterns in market behavior that detail-oriented people missed, to solve problems through visual thinking that linear thinkers couldn't access, and to connect ideas across disciplines in ways that specialized experts often overlooked. Your brain makes leaps that other people have to calculate step by step, he said, when I shared some business ideas I'd developed while working at the bookstore. That's not a deficit. That's innovation happening at the speed of intuition. Inspired by his approach, I began developing software applications designed specifically for people with learning differences, budgeting tools that used visual representations instead of spreadsheets, project management systems that accommodated non-linear thinking, and communication platforms that supported different cognitive processing styles. My first app, Visual Finance, was created to solve my own struggles with money management. Traditional budgeting software required mathematical thinking that didn't match how I understood financial relationships, so I designed a system that used colors, shapes, and spatial relationships to represent financial information. The app gained traction quickly among users who'd been underserved by conventional financial software. People with dyslexia, ADHD, and autism spectrum conditions found that my visual approach made money management accessible in ways that traditional tools never had. "This is the first budgeting app I've ever been able to use successfully," wrote one reviewer. "It's like it was designed by someone who actually understands how my brain works, instead of how my brain should work." The success of Visual Finance led to funding from investors who recognized the market potential for accessibility-focused technology. Within 2 years, I'd built a company that employed 12 people and served over 100,000 users worldwide, all while maintaining the principle that cognitive differences were design opportunities rather than problems to solve. But the real breakthrough came when major corporations began licensing my accessibility technologies for their own applications. Companies discovered that features designed for neurodivergent users actually improved usability for everyone, creating more intuitive interfaces that benefited their entire customer base. Universal design isn't just good ethics, it's good business, I explained during my presentation to Microsoft's accessibility team. When you design for cognitive diversity, you create products that work better for all users, not just those with diagnosed differences. The licensing deals transformed my small company into a major player in accessibility technology, generating revenue streams that supported both continued innovation and expansion into new markets. By my 30th birthday, I was running a business worth $50 million that employed over 200 people across 3 continents. More importantly, I'd created a company culture that valued different kinds of intelligence and problem-solving approaches. My employees included people with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and other neurological differences who'd been overlooked by traditional tech companies, but whose unique perspectives drove innovation that conventionally educated teams couldn't achieve. Isabella's company proves that diversity isn't just about fairness. It's about competitive advantage, wrote the journalist who profiled my work for Forbes. She's built a business model around the principle that cognitive differences are features, not bugs, in human thinking. The irony wasn't lost on me that the learning disabilities Daniel had mocked as evidence of my inevitable failure had become the foundation for success that exceeded anything his traditional academic achievements had generated. The pattern recognition that made reading difficult helped me identify market opportunities that others missed, and the creative problem-solving that frustrated teachers had become my signature strength as an entrepreneur. But success felt incomplete, without resolution of the family trauma that had motivated my determination to prove them wrong. I'd built an empire from the ashes of their rejection, but I'd also been carrying the weight of their dismissal for 14 years, letting their judgment define my self-worth even as I contradicted their predictions about my potential. The day Daniel walked into my office, I was forced to confront whether my success had been motivated by love of the work itself, or by the desire to prove that their assessment of my worthlessness had been catastrophically wrong. While I was building my accessibility technology empire in Portland, Daniel was following the traditional path to success that our family had always assumed would lead to greatness: Harvard Law Review, prestigious clerkship, associate position at one of Boston's most elite firms. From the outside, his trajectory looked exactly like the professional fairy tale our parents had been writing since his childhood. Morrison, Blackwell and Associates was the kind of legal practice that appeared in magazine articles about America's most powerful law firms, with marble lobbies, mahogany conference rooms, and billable hour requirements that turned brilliant young attorneys into highly compensated indentured servants. Daniel's starting salary was $180,000 per year, more money than our parents had ever earned combined, and came with the social prestige that made extended family gatherings feel like victory celebrations. Daniel's already being considered for partnership track, Mom would tell anyone who would listen during the first years of his legal career. The senior partners say he has the kind of analytical mind that could reshape the practice. We always knew he was destined for extraordinary things. The work itself was intellectually demanding, but emotionally hollow. Corporate mergers, regulatory compliance, and contract negotiations that moved millions of dollars while serving clients whose primary qualification was their ability to pay premium rates for legal expertise. Daniel excelled at the analytical thinking required for complex transactions, but the success felt mechanical rather than meaningful. "We're not changing the world," he confessed to his girlfriend Sarah during one of their increasingly rare dinners together. "We're just helping rich people get richer through legal loopholes and strategic regulatory interpretation. Sometimes I wonder if this is what I actually wanted, or just what I was expected to want." But questioning the path felt impossible when everyone in his life was invested in his continued advancement. Our parents had built their identity around his achievements. His colleagues treated him as naturally destined for partnership, and his social circle consisted entirely of people whose success was measured through the same metrics of prestige and compensation. The pressure to maintain excellence was relentless and often overwhelming. 70-hour work weeks were standard, 80-hour weeks were common during major transactions, and the expectation was that personal relationships would accommodate professional demands rather than the reverse. Sarah, who worked as a marketing executive, initially tried to understand the demands of Daniel's career, but the relationship slowly deteriorated under the weight of constant cancellations, missed commitments, and conversations that revolved around work stress rather than shared interests or emotional connection. "I feel like I'm dating your career rather than you," she told him during their final argument. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about billable hours or partnership politics? When did you become so consumed by work that you forgot how to be a person?" The breakup was devastating, but also revealing. Daniel realized he'd been defining himself so completely through professional achievement that he'd lost touch with other aspects of his identity and values. But changing course felt impossible when his entire social and financial structure was built around continued advancement in a career that was making him successful, but not happy. The partnership track at Morrison, Blackwell was brutally competitive, with 12 associates competing for 2 positions that would be decided based on billable hours, client development, and the kind of political maneuvering that had nothing to do with legal expertise. Daniel's natural intelligence gave him advantages in case preparation, but his social skills were less developed than those of colleagues who'd learned to network and manipulate as efficiently as they'd learned to practice law. "Partnership isn't just about being a good lawyer," explained Marcus Blackwell, one of the firm's founding partners. "It's about being someone clients trust with their most important legal needs, someone who can represent our firm in the community, someone who embodies the values and reputation we've spent decades building." The requirements for partnership extended far beyond professional competence to include social connections, community involvement, and the kind of personal branding that Daniel had never needed to develop during his academic career. He was brilliant at legal analysis but awkward at client dinners, exceptional at research, but uncomfortable with the relationship management that generated business. His colleagues, meanwhile, had been cultivating the social skills necessary for partnership advancement since their undergraduate years. They belonged to the right clubs, dated people from appropriate social circles, and understood instinctively how to present themselves as embodiments of the firm's prestigious brand. Daniel's work product is excellent, he overheard one partner telling another during his partnership evaluation year. But I'm not sure he has the presence we need for client-facing responsibilities. Some people are better suited for behind-the-scenes work rather than leadership roles. The partnership rejection was delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that made failure sound like career guidance. Daniel was offered a permanent senior associate position with increased compensation, but no equity stake in the firm, essentially acknowledging that he was valuable enough to retain, but not considered leadership material. This gives you more time to develop the relationship skills that partnership requires, the managing partner explained during their private meeting. Some attorneys take longer to mature into the kind of presence our clients expect from firm partners, but Daniel understood the subtext. He was being permanently classified as a talented worker, rather than recognized as future leadership material. The golden child who'd been groomed for greatness since childhood was discovering that professional success required skills that academic achievement had never demanded. The years following his partnership rejection were marked by increasing cynicism about his career choice and growing awareness that the traditional measures of success he'd been pursuing might not lead to the kind of life he actually wanted to live. But he was also trapped by financial obligations and social expectations that made career changes feel impossible. His lifestyle required his substantial salary, his social identity was built around his professional status, and admitting that his chosen path wasn't fulfilling would require acknowledging that everything he'd been working toward for 30 years might have been a mistake. The descent from golden child to struggling professional would take several more years, but the foundation for his eventual crisis was laid during those partnership years, when he learned that being the smartest person in the room wasn't sufficient for the kind of success he'd been promised since childhood. The first crack in Daniel's carefully constructed professional facade appeared during his 7th year at Morrison Blackwell, when his increasing reliance on Adderall to manage 70-hour work weeks escalated from doctor-prescribed focus enhancement to self-medicated survival strategy. What had started as legitimate treatment for adult ADHD became dependency on stimulants that provided artificial energy and concentration, while masking his growing exhaustion and disillusionment. "I need something stronger," he told Dr. Williams during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. "The standard dose isn't providing adequate focus for the demands of my caseload. My productivity is declining, and I can't afford to fall behind at work." Dr. Williams, concerned about the increasing frequency of Daniel's dosage requests, suggested stress management techniques and lifestyle modifications, rather than additional medication. But Daniel was too invested in maintaining his performance levels to consider approaches that might require acknowledging that his career demands were unsustainable. Instead, he began supplementing his prescription with additional stimulants purchased through less official channels, colleagues who shared their excess medications, online pharmacies that didn't require prescriptions, and eventually street-level sources when his tolerance required dosages that legitimate medical providers wouldn't prescribe. The chemical enhancement provided temporary solutions to immediate problems while creating larger issues that Daniel was too focused on short-term performance to recognize. His sleep patterns became erratic, his appetite disappeared, and his personality shifted toward the kind of aggressive intensity that his colleagues initially interpreted as increased dedication to his work. "Daniel's really stepped up his game this year," observed Janet Chen, another senior associate. "His billable hours are through the roof, and his case preparation is more thorough than ever. Whatever he's doing differently is working, but the enhanced performance was unsustainable and built on chemical foundations that were slowly destroying his physical and mental health. The stimulants that improved his focus during work hours left him unable to relax during off hours, creating a cycle of artificial energy followed by crushing exhaustion that required additional substances to manage. His personal relationships deteriorated as his personality became increasingly volatile and unpredictable. Friends stopped inviting him to social events where his intense energy and rapid speech made conversations uncomfortable, while family members began commenting on his dramatic weight loss and erratic behavior during holiday gatherings. "Daniel seems very energetic lately," Mom mentioned to Dad after a particularly uncomfortable family dinner, where Daniel had dominated conversations with manic enthusiasm about cases that no one else could understand. "I hope he's not working too hard." Success shouldn't come at the expense of health, but Daniel was too deep into dependency patterns to recognize the warning signs that were obvious to everyone around him. The drugs that had initially enhanced his performance were now necessary just to function at basic levels, while his tolerance required constantly increasing dosages that pushed his system beyond safe limits. The crisis arrived during a major merger negotiation, where Daniel's stimulant-enhanced intensity finally crossed the line from dedicated advocacy into erratic behavior that clients couldn't ignore. His rapid speech, aggressive tactics, and obvious physical agitation made opposing counsel question his mental stability and professional competence. "I'm concerned about Mr. Morrison's condition," the opposing team's lead attorney told Daniel's supervising partner after a particularly volatile negotiation session. His behavior today was unprofessional and potentially indicative of substance issues that could affect the integrity of these proceedings. The complaint triggered a firm investigation that quickly revealed the scope of Daniel's drug use and its impact on his work quality. What his colleagues had interpreted as enhanced dedication was actually chemical dependency that had been affecting his judgment and professional behavior for months. "We're recommending that you enter a treatment program," the managing partner explained during the disciplinary meeting that would end Daniel's career at Morrison Blackwell. "The firm is willing to support your recovery process, but we can't maintain your employment while these issues remain unresolved." The treatment program was effective for addressing his chemical dependency, but devastating for his professional prospects. The legal community in Boston was small enough that news of his rehabilitation spread quickly, making him unemployable at firms that valued reputation as much as competence. "Daniel Morrison? Didn't he have some kind of breakdown at Morrison Blackwell?" became the standard response when his name appeared on job applications. "Brilliant attorney, but there were substance issues. Not the kind of person we can afford to have representing our clients." The fall from prestigious law firm associate to unemployable attorney took less than 2 years, during which Daniel's financial situation deteriorated as rapidly as his professional reputation. The lifestyle he'd built around a 6-figure salary became impossible to maintain without income, while his legal training provided no practical skills for alternative career paths. His parents, who'd built their identity around his achievements, struggled to understand how their golden child had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of professional pressure and substance abuse. Their disappointment was palpable during family interactions that became increasingly rare as Daniel's situation worsened. "We thought Daniel was so stable," Mom confided to her sister during one of their weekly phone calls. "Harvard Law, prestigious firm, seemed like he had everything figured out. We never imagined he could fall so far so quickly." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel that the sister he dismissed as dead weight was now running a successful company, while he was struggling to find employment that paid enough to cover basic living expenses. The academic achievements that had once seemed like guarantees of lifelong success had proven less valuable than the resilience and creativity he'd mocked as evidence of my intellectual inadequacy. By his 14th year out of law school, Daniel was working temporary legal document review positions that paid hourly wages without benefits or advancement opportunities, essentially functioning as a highly educated day laborer in the legal industry he'd once expected to dominate. The decision to approach me for employment was motivated by desperation rather than family reconciliation, but it was also acknowledgement that his assessment of my potential had been catastrophically wrong, and that the sister he'd humiliated was now his only hope for rebuilding a career that traditional pathways had closed to him. By the time Daniel walked into my office seeking employment, my company, Neurodverse Technologies, had evolved from a startup focused on accessibility apps into a global leader in cognitive inclusion software that served Fortune 500 companies, educational institutions, and government agencies worldwide. The building that housed our headquarters was a testament to how much the learning disabled girl they'd written off had accomplished. 5 floors of open-concept workspace designed specifically to accommodate different cognitive processing styles and sensory needs. Our lobby featured a living wall of plants, chosen for their calming visual properties, adjustable lighting systems that could be modified for individual preferences, and quiet zones where employees who needed minimal stimulation could work effectively alongside collaborative spaces for those who thrived on interactive energy. Every design choice reflected our core principle that human cognitive diversity was a feature to be supported rather than a problem to be solved. Isabella Morrison, CEO and founder, read the nameplate on my corner office door, the golden letters catching afternoon sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. The view encompassed not just Portland's skyline, but the symbolic distance I'd traveled from the family basement where Daniel had predicted I'd spend my 40s struggling with basic life skills. My daily schedule was packed with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible to the dyslexic college dropout my family had dismissed. board meetings with investors who valued my company at $200 million, strategic planning sessions for international expansion, and research collaborations with universities studying the intersection of neurodiversity and innovation. Neurodiverse technologies represents a paradigm shift in how we think about human cognitive variation, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the neuroscientist who joined our advisory board after leaving her position at Stanford. Isabella's approach to designing for cognitive differences has created technologies that don't just accommodate diversity, they leverage it as a competitive advantage. Our flagship product, the Cognitive Inclusion Platform, was being used by over 500 companies to create workplace environments that supported employees across the entire spectrum of neurological differences. The software provided customizable interfaces that could be adjusted for ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and other cognitive styles, while maintaining functionality that enhanced productivity for neurotypical users as well. Traditional software assumes everyone processes information the same way, I explained during my keynote presentation at the Global Technology Innovation Conference. But cognitive diversity is actually a tremendous untapped resource. When you design systems that work with different thinking styles rather than against them, you unlock human potential that standardized approaches leave inaccessible. The financial success had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Our annual revenue had reached $75 million, with profit margins that reflected the value companies placed on inclusion technologies that improved both employee satisfaction and organizational performance. But the money was secondary to the validation that my approach to cognitive differences was transforming how major institutions thought about human potential. More meaningful than the financial metrics was the impact on individual lives. Our technologies were being used by students who'd struggled in traditional educational settings, employees who'd been marginalized in conventional workplaces, and entrepreneurs who'd been excluded from business opportunities that didn't accommodate their cognitive processing styles. "Your software saved my career," wrote one user whose ADHD had made traditional project management tools unusable. "For the first time, I have systems that work with my brain instead of against it. I've been promoted twice since my company started using your platform." The testimonials arrived daily from people who'd discovered that their cognitive differences weren't obstacles to overcome, but assets to leverage when provided with appropriate technological support. Each success story validated the principle that had driven my work since those early days in Mrs. Chen's bookstore. Intelligence comes in many forms, and success requires creating systems that recognize rather than suppress cognitive diversity. My team reflected this philosophy in practice. Our 200 employees included people with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and other neurological differences, who brought perspectives and problem-solving approaches that homogeneous teams couldn't generate. The diversity wasn't tokenism, but strategic advantage. Our products were more innovative because they emerged from genuinely diverse thinking rather than conventional approaches. Isabella's company culture proves that inclusion isn't just about fairness, it's about competitive edge, wrote the Harvard Business Review journalist who profiled our organizational model. She's created a workspace where cognitive differences are treated as specialized expertise rather than accommodations to be managed. The recognition had extended beyond business publications to academic research and policy discussions about educational reform and workplace inclusion. I'd been invited to testify before congressional committees studying neurodiversity legislation, consulted with international organizations developing cognitive accessibility standards, and featured in documentaries about innovative approaches to human potential. But the success felt incomplete, without resolution of the family relationships that had motivated my determination to prove their assessment wrong. I'd built an empire that contradicted every prediction they'd made about my future, yet I'd remained estranged from the people whose approval had once seemed essential for my self-worth. The corner office where I now worked featured photos of our team's achievements, awards recognizing our technological innovations, and artwork created by employees whose neurodivergent perspectives influenced both our products and our company culture. But absent from these displays were any family photographs or personal mementos that connected my professional success to the personal relationships that had shaped my understanding of cognitive difference through rejection and dismissal. When Daniel appeared in our lobby yesterday, asking to speak with the CEO about employment opportunities, I realized that the conversation I'd been avoiding for 14 years was finally unavoidable. The golden child who'd predicted my failure was now seeking assistance from the empire I'd built from the ashes of his cruelty, and the terms of our reunion would be determined by whether I chose revenge or reconciliation as the foundation for whatever relationship we might build going forward. The girl he'd called dead weight was now in a position to determine his professional future, and the irony was almost too perfect to be believed. The morning Daniel decided to approach me for employment, he'd been unemployed for 8 months, and facing eviction from the studio apartment that represented the final stage of his financial decline from Harvard law graduate to barely surviving temp worker. His last position, reviewing legal documents for $25 per hour without benefits, had ended when the contracting agency discovered his history of substance abuse through background checks that were becoming increasingly thorough as his reputation preceded him through Boston's legal community. "I'm sorry, but we can't continue your assignment," the temp agency supervisor had explained during what was supposed to be a routine check-in meeting. "Our client specifically requested attorneys without any history of disciplinary issues or rehabilitation. Your record makes you ineligible for assignments that require security clearances or client confidentiality." The explanation was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made rejection feel like policy rather than personal judgment, but Daniel understood the implications. His past had become a permanent barrier to employment in the legal field, where he'd invested 12 years of education and training. His financial situation had deteriorated beyond the point where pride could justify continued isolation from family resources that might provide temporary relief. The credit cards were maxed out, the student loan payments were 3 months behind, and his landlord had posted eviction notices that gave him 30 days to pay accumulated rent or face homelessness. "Mr. Morrison, I understand that unemployment creates financial hardship," his landlord explained during their final conversation about past due rent, "but I can't carry tenants indefinitely. You need to either pay what you owe or make arrangements to vacate the apartment by the end of the month." The prospect of homelessness forced Daniel to confront realities he'd been avoiding through months of denial and self-deception. His law degree was worthless without employer trust. His professional network had evaporated along with his reputation, and his family relationships had been too damaged by years of arrogance and dismissal to provide the kind of support that desperate circumstances required. The decision to research my professional situation was motivated by curiosity, mixed with the kind of desperate hope that comes from exhausted alternatives. A simple Google search for Isabella Morrison revealed a success story that contradicted everything he'd believed about my limitations and potential. Neurodiverse Technologies, CEO named to Forbes 40 Under 40 list, read the first headline that appeared in his search results. Isabella Morrison's company revolutionizes accessibility technology while employing 200+ people worldwide. The articles about my achievements were accompanied by photographs showing a confident woman in professional settings that Daniel couldn't reconcile with his memories of the struggling student who'd required constant academic support. I was addressing conferences, meeting with investors, and leading a company that had achieved exactly the kind of meaningful success that his traditional path had failed to provide. The drive from Boston to Portland gave Daniel 6 hours to rehearse conversations that might convince me to consider his employment, despite our complicated family history. When he finally reached my office building, he was forced to confront the complete reversal of our childhood dynamic and prepare to ask for help from someone who had every reason to refuse. When my assistant buzzed to announce that Daniel Morrison was in the lobby requesting a meeting about employment opportunities, I felt my chest tighten with the same anxiety I'd experienced 14 years earlier during his graduation speech. But this time, I was sitting behind a CEO's desk in my own company, rather than standing helplessly among family members who'd failed to defend me from his cruelty. "Should I tell him you're unavailable?" asked Jessica, my assistant, who'd noticed my pause and probably sensed the complexity of whatever family dynamic was about to unfold in my office. "I can schedule something for next week if you need time to prepare." "No," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Send him up. Let's get this conversation over with." I had 10 minutes to compose myself while Daniel made his way through our building, past the employee success stories displayed in our corridors, through the collaborative workspaces where people with cognitive differences created innovations that traditional teams couldn't generate. Every step of his journey to my office was a tour of the empire I'd built from the ashes of his dismissal. When he knocked on my door, I took a deep breath and opened it to find a man who bore little resemblance to the confident Harvard graduate who'd once predicted my failure. Daniel looked exhausted, humbled, and desperate in ways that would have seemed impossible during his years as the family's golden child. "Isabella," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for seeing me. I know this is unexpected." I gestured for him to enter my office, watching as his eyes took in the space that represented everything he'd claimed I could never achieve. The awards on my walls, the view overlooking Portland's skyline, the evidence of success that had been built through the very cognitive differences he'd mocked as evidence of my inevitable failure. "Sit down," I said, settling behind my desk in the position of power that our childhood dynamic had never allowed me to occupy. "Tell me why you're here." Daniel perched nervously on the edge of the chair across from my desk, clearly struggling with the role reversal that had transformed our relationship from his superiority and my inadequacy to his desperation and my authority. "I need a job," he said simply, abandoning whatever eloquent speech he'd probably rehearsed during his drive from Boston. "My legal career is over. I'm facing eviction, and I've exhausted every other option for employment. I know I have no right to ask for your help after everything I said and did, but I'm desperate." The admission was more honest than anything he'd ever shared with me during our childhood, stripped of the arrogance and performative superiority that had defined his personality for as long as I'd known him. This was vulnerability that he'd never shown before, need that he'd never had to acknowledge. "What makes you think I would help you?" I asked, not cruelly, but directly. "After you called me dead weight in front of our entire family? After you spent our childhood making me feel worthless? Why would I risk my company's reputation by hiring someone who's treated me with such consistent cruelty?" Daniel flinched as if I'd struck him, his face cycling through shame, regret, and the kind of desperate calculation that comes from having no alternatives left to explore. "Because you're a better person than I am," he said finally. "Because you've built a company that values people who've been marginalized by traditional systems, and I'm hoping that compassion might extend to someone who's been marginalized by his own mistakes and failures." The conversation was approaching territory that would require decisions about forgiveness, second chances, and whether our family trauma could be transformed into healing, rather than perpetuated through justified revenge. As Daniel sat across from my desk, preparing to accept whatever decision I made about his employment, his phone buzzed with a text message that made his face go completely white. He stared at the screen with the expression of someone who'd just received devastating news, his hands trembling as he read words that seemed to drain all remaining hope from his already desperate situation. "I'm sorry," he said, looking up from his phone with tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I need to tell you something before you make any decisions about hiring me, something that changes everything about why I treated you so terribly during our childhood." The shift in his demeanor was so dramatic that I felt my own anxiety spike in response. Whatever information he'd just received was clearly more devastating than unemployment or eviction. This was the kind of news that shattered fundamental assumptions about reality. "That text was from Mom," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Dad's in the hospital. They think it's a heart attack. But while they were running tests, they discovered something else, something he's apparently been hiding from our family for 30 years. I waited, sensing that whatever revelation was coming would recontextualize our entire shared history in ways that neither of us was prepared to handle. "I'm not your brother," Daniel said, the words emerging like a confession that had been buried under decades of family secrets. "You're not adopted, Isabella. I am. Dad had an affair when I was born, and his biological son, me, was the evidence of that betrayal that Mom agreed to raise rather than face the scandal of divorce." The information hit me like physical violence, forcing me to reconstruct everything I'd believed about our family dynamics and the favoritism that had shaped our childhood. The golden child hadn't been their biological son. He'd been the constant reminder of marital infidelity that everyone had conspired to hide through elaborate performance of family unity. The learning disabilities, the different treatment, the way you never quite fit their expectations. None of that was because you were inadequate, Daniel continued, his voice breaking with emotion and revelation. You were their legitimate daughter being raised alongside the illegitimate son, whose presence reminded them daily of Dad's betrayal of their marriage. I stared at him, processing implications that made our childhood trauma even more complex than I'd imagined. The cognitive differences that had made me feel defective were actually normal variations that any child might experience, while the pressure on Daniel to be perfect had been motivated by their desperate need to justify keeping the son who represented their family's deepest shame. They couldn't love me naturally because I wasn't theirs, he explained, tears now streaming down his face, but they couldn't get rid of me without admitting the affair. So they overcompensated by making me the golden child, pushing me to achieve at levels that would validate their decision to keep me, despite the pain my existence caused. The revelation reframed every memory of our childhood through a different lens. Daniel's academic pressure hadn't been normal parental expectations, but desperate attempts to prove that keeping him had been worthwhile. My struggles hadn't been evidence of inadequacy, but normal child development that seemed disappointing only when compared to Daniel's artificially inflated achievements. The cruelty toward you was learned behavior, he continued. I was modeling Mom's resentment about having to raise another woman's child, while Dad's guilt made him unable to defend either of us from the toxic dynamics his affair had created. But why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice steady despite the emotional hurricane raging in my chest. Because Dad's medical records include genetic information that reveals the truth about our parentage, Daniel replied. Mom finally admitted everything to the doctors when they needed family medical history for his treatment. She said she couldn't keep lying when his life might depend on accurate genetic information. The conversation was reshaping not just our relationship, but my understanding of my own identity and the family trauma that had motivated years of determination to prove my worth to people whose judgment had been distorted by secrets I'd never known existed. 6 months after Daniel's devastating confession in my office, we stood together in Dad's hospital room as he recovered from the surgery that had saved his life, while simultaneously exposing the family secrets that had shaped our entire childhood. The man who'd been too weak to defend either of his children from the toxic dynamics his affair had created was finally strong enough to face the consequences of 30 years of deception. "I owe both of you apologies that can never adequately address the damage I caused," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more emotional honesty than I'd ever heard from him during our childhood. "The affair was my mistake, but the way we handled its consequences hurt both of you, in ways that I'm only beginning to understand." Daniel sat beside his hospital bed, no longer the arrogant golden child, but not yet the redeemed man he hoped to become, through acknowledging his own trauma and taking responsibility for how that trauma had affected his treatment of me. The months of family therapy had been difficult for all of us, but they'd been essential for untangling decades of psychological damage that had masqueraded as normal family dysfunction. Isabella deserved parents who celebrated her achievements instead of minimizing them to make me feel superior, Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of insights that therapy had helped him develop. And I deserved to know that the pressure to be perfect was artificial, rather than evidence of my natural superiority. The family sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been brutal but transformative, forcing all of us to confront how secrets and shame had created patterns of emotional abuse that none of us had recognized at the time, because they'd been normalized through years of practice. Children internalize family dynamics as if they're natural laws, Dr. Martinez had explained during one of our sessions. Isabella learned that love was conditional on achieving impossible standards, while Daniel learned that his worth depended on maintaining artificial superiority over his sister. Both lessons were psychologically damaging, but the therapy had also revealed our capacity for healing that went beyond simply understanding our trauma to actively transforming the relationship patterns that had governed our family interactions. Daniel's employment at my company had become a testing ground for whether we could build authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical competition. His role as our legal affairs coordinator utilized his analytical skills while requiring him to work closely with employees whose cognitive differences had been marginalized by traditional legal institutions. The position forced him to develop empathy and inclusion practices that his previous career had never demanded, while providing him with meaningful work that served our mission rather than just generating billable hours. Daniel's transformation has been remarkable, observed Maria Santos, our Director of Human Resources. He's gone from someone who probably never considered neurodiversity as a professional asset to being one of our most effective advocates for cognitive inclusion in legal compliance. The change hadn't been easy or automatic. Daniel had struggled with adjusting to a workplace culture that valued collaboration over competition, empathy over efficiency, and authentic relationship building over strategic networking. But his desperation for redemption had motivated genuine effort to understand perspectives that his privileged background had never required him to consider. More importantly, our professional relationship had created opportunities for personal healing that neither of us could have achieved through family therapy alone. Working together daily, we'd learned to see each other as competent adults, rather than the damaged children we'd been during our traumatic childhood. "I'm proud of what you've built here," Daniel told me during one of our weekly check-in meetings. "Not just the business success, but the culture you've created where people like me can learn to be better than we were when we arrived. That's a gift you didn't have to give someone who'd been so cruel to you." The forgiveness hadn't been immediate or simple. Daniel's employment had been conditional on his commitment to therapy, his willingness to acknowledge the harm he'd caused, and his active participation in learning about cognitive diversity and inclusion practices. Redemption required work, rather than just recognition of past mistakes. Standing in Dad's hospital room 6 months after the revelation that had transformed our understanding of our family, I realized that the greatest success I'd achieved wasn't building a multi-million-dollar company, but learning that forgiveness could coexist with boundaries, that healing could emerge from truth-telling, and that family relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of honesty, rather than maintained through elaborate deceptions. Daniel would never be the brother I'd needed during our childhood, but he was becoming the colleague and family member who could support the woman I'd become, despite rather than because of our shared trauma. The dead weight he'd once called me had become the foundation for both our healing, proving that sometimes the people who wound us most deeply can also participate in our redemption if they're willing to do the work that genuine change requires. Looking back now, I understand that the moment I called Isabella dead weight at my Harvard graduation wasn't just cruelty. It was the desperate performance of a child who'd learned that his worth depended on diminishing someone else's light to make his own seem brighter. I was 24 years old, draped in academic honors that felt hollow even as I wore them, speaking words that would haunt me for 14 years until I found myself broken and desperate at her office door. The laughter that followed my declaration wasn't celebration of my wit, but complicity in a family dynamic so toxic that everyone participated rather than confront the dysfunction we'd normalized. I see now that I was as much a victim of our parents' deception as Isabella was, though my victimization came wrapped in privilege that made it invisible to everyone, including myself. The pressure to be perfect, to justify my existence in a family where I was the living reminder of betrayal, had turned me into a weapon aimed at the one person who deserved my protection instead of my cruelty. That graduation day marked the peak of my performance as the golden child, but it was also the beginning of a slow-motion collapse that would teach me the difference between success built on others' failures and achievement earned through authentic effort. The Harvard degree hanging on my wall had been less a symbol of my intelligence than a certificate of my family's desperation to prove that keeping the evidence of an affair had been worthwhile. The years that followed my graduation were a masterclass in how privilege without purpose creates its own form of suffering, though I was too blinded by entitlement to recognize my growing emptiness as anything other than the natural pressures of professional advancement. Morrison, Blackwell & Associates became my prison disguised as a palace, where 70-hour weeks and six-figure salaries couldn't fill the void where authentic self-worth should have resided. I threw myself into legal work with the manic intensity of someone running from questions I couldn't answer about who I was beyond my achievements, what I valued beyond external validation, and why success felt more like elaborate performance than genuine fulfillment. The stimulants that initially enhanced my focus became the chemical scaffolding holding up a personality that had been constructed to please parents who couldn't love me naturally because I wasn't theirs to love. Every case I won, every client I impressed, every partner who praised my analytical skills was another brick in a wall between my authentic self and the world, until I'd built such an elaborate fortress of professional identity that I forgot there was a person trapped inside. The addiction that destroyed my career wasn't really about drugs. It was about the impossibility of maintaining artificial excellence indefinitely when your entire sense of self depends on being something you're not. My fall from grace wasn't a deviation from my path, but the inevitable conclusion of a journey that had been unsustainable from its very beginning. The morning I decided to approach Isabella for employment, I had been staring at eviction notices while Googling my sister's name with the desperate hope that she might be doing well enough to help me, never imagining that I would discover an empire built from the ashes of my dismissal. The search results showing her Forbes recognition, her company's valuation, her role as a CEO revolutionizing accessibility technology hit me like a series of physical blows that left me gasping in my empty apartment. Each article about her achievements was evidence that everything I'd believed about intelligence, success, and human worth had been not just wrong, but catastrophically destructive to the person whose potential I'd been too blinded by my own insecurity to recognize. I spent hours reading about neurodiverse technologies, understanding for the first time that the learning differences I'd mocked as evidence of her inadequacy had become the foundation for innovations that were transforming how major corporations approached cognitive inclusion. The irony was so complete, it felt like cosmic justice. The sister I'd called dead weight had built a business around the principle that human cognitive diversity was a strength to be leveraged rather than a weakness to be hidden. Her success wasn't just professional achievement, but moral vindication of everything I'd dismissed as worthless, proof that intelligence comes in forms that traditional education systems and traditional families often fail to recognize or value. The drive from Boston to Portland gave me 6 hours to rehearse apologies that could never adequately address the scope of my cruelty, but also to confront the possibility that redemption might require more than just acknowledgement of harm. It might require complete reconstruction of my understanding of worth, family, and what it means to be human. Walking into Isabella's office building was like entering a cathedral dedicated to values I'd never learned to practice: inclusion, empathy, and the radical belief that every person's cognitive differences could contribute to collective innovation rather than individual competition. The lobby displayed employee success stories that read like testaments to the transformative power of workplaces, designed around accommodation rather than assimilation, where people with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and other neurological differences weren't just tolerated but celebrated as essential contributors to organizational excellence. Every step toward her office was a journey through the implications of the worldview I'd rejected, surrounded by evidence that the soft values I'd dismissed as irrelevant to serious business were actually the foundation for the kind of meaningful success that had eluded me despite all my traditional credentials. The golden letters spelling Isabella Morrison CEO on her door weren't just a nameplate, but a monument to the possibility that the people society discards might be the ones with the most valuable perspectives on how to build better systems for everyone. Standing outside her office, I was forced to confront not just my desperate need for employment, but my even deeper need for forgiveness from someone who had every reason to refuse both my professional application and my personal plea for mercy. The woman I was about to face had succeeded without family support, had built her identity around values I'd never been taught to appreciate, and had every right to let me experience the consequences of my own choices without offering the grace I'd never shown her. The conversation we were about to have would determine not just whether I could rebuild my career, but whether I was capable of the kind of fundamental change that redemption requires, the willingness to become someone worthy of the forgiveness I desperately needed, but had never earned. The revelation about my adoption, discovered through Dad's medical crisis and Mom's hospital confession, didn't excuse my behavior, but it explained the psychological dynamics that had shaped our family's dysfunction in ways that made healing possible, rather than just therapeutically recommended. Learning that I was the product of Dad's affair, the living reminder of betrayal that Mom had agreed to raise rather than face divorce, recontextualized every memory of our childhood through the lens of trauma that none of us had understood at the time. The pressure to be perfect, the artificial inflation of my achievements, the desperate need to justify my presence in a family where I represented shame rather than joy, all of it suddenly made sense as responses to impossible circumstances rather than evidence of natural superiority or inherited worthiness. Isabella's struggles hadn't been evidence of her inadequacy, but normal child development that seemed disappointing only when compared to my artificially supported accomplishments, while my cruelty toward her had been learned behavior modeled after the emotional distance our parents maintained to protect themselves from confronting the truth about our origins. The family therapy sessions that followed were exercises in archaeological excavation, digging through decades of buried trauma to understand how secrets and shame had created patterns of abuse that we'd mistaken for normal sibling rivalry. Dr. Martinez helped us understand that children absorb family dynamics as if they're natural laws, internalizing dysfunction as personal truth rather than recognizing it as the result of adult choices that had nothing to do with our inherent worth or potential. The healing process required not just understanding our trauma, but actively choosing to break cycles of harm that had been passed down through generations of family members who'd never learned healthier ways to process pain, disappointment, and the complex realities of human relationships. Working at Neurodiverse Technologies became my education in values I'd never been taught to practice: collaboration instead of competition, empathy instead of efficiency, and the revolutionary idea that my job was to help create systems that elevated other people rather than just advancing my own career prospects. My role as legal affairs coordinator required me to develop inclusion practices that my previous legal training had never addressed, learning to write policies and procedures that accommodated cognitive differences while ensuring compliance with regulations that hadn't been designed with neurodiversity in mind. The employees I worked with daily, people with autism who brought systematic thinking to complex problems, colleagues with ADHD whose creative approaches generated innovations that linear thinkers couldn't access, team members with dyslexia whose pattern recognition skills identified market opportunities that traditional analysis might miss, taught me that intelligence comes in forms that law school had never prepared me to recognize or value. Isabella's leadership style was everything mine had never been: patient rather than demanding, inclusive rather than hierarchical, focused on collective success rather than individual achievement, and grounded in the belief that everyone's cognitive differences contributed essential perspectives that homogeneous teams couldn't generate. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. I struggled with adjusting to a workplace culture that valued authentic relationship building over strategic networking, that measured success through positive impact on others rather than just personal advancement. And that required emotional intelligence I'd never developed during my years of academic and professional competition. But the work was meaningful in ways that billable hours and partnership tracks had never been, contributing to something larger than my own career prospects while helping to create opportunities for people whose potential had been overlooked by traditional employment systems. My desperation for redemption had motivated genuine effort to understand perspectives that my privileged background had never required me to consider, and gradually I began to experience the satisfaction that comes from using whatever skills you have in service of values that matter more than personal gain. The relationship Isabella and I have built over these 5 years isn't the brotherhood we might have had if our childhood had been different, but it's something more valuable. an authentic connection between two adults who've learned to see each other clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of family trauma and toxic competition. Our weekly check-in meetings have become opportunities for honest conversation about our ongoing healing process, our different perspectives on family dynamics, and our shared commitment to breaking cycles of harm that had defined our parents' approach to relationships. I've learned to appreciate Isabella not just as my employer, but as someone whose intelligence, creativity, and moral courage represent everything I'd been taught to dismiss as weakness, but now recognize as essential human qualities that our world desperately needs. She's learned to see me not as the golden child who'd always had everything handed to him, but as someone whose own trauma had created patterns of behavior that were destructive to both of us, and whose willingness to do the hard work of change could contribute to healing that benefited our entire family system. The forgiveness she's offered hasn't been cheap or immediate. It's been conditional on my continued commitment to therapy, my willingness to acknowledge the harm I caused, and my active participation in creating workplace cultures that support, rather than marginalize people whose thinking styles don't conform to traditional expectations. Working together daily has taught us both that family relationships can be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect, rather than hierarchy, shared values rather than competition, and authentic connection, rather than the performance of unity that had characterized our parents' approach to managing family dysfunction. The professional success I'm experiencing now feels different from my previous achievements because it's grounded in service to something meaningful rather than just personal advancement, supported by relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation, and measured through positive impact on other people's lives rather than just individual accumulation of wealth or status. Today, 5 years after I walked into Isabella's office as a desperate man seeking employment from the sister I'd spent our childhood destroying, I understand that the greatest gift she gave me wasn't the job that saved my career, but the opportunity to discover who I could become when my worth wasn't dependent on diminishing someone else's light. The work we do at Neurodiverse Technologies matters not just because it generates profit, but because it creates systems that recognize and support human cognitive diversity as a strength rather than a problem to be solved, contributing to a world where people like Isabella and people like me can thrive according to our authentic natures rather than struggle to conform to narrow definitions of acceptable intelligence or achievement. My relationship with our parents has evolved from the artificial performance of the golden child to honest conversations about trauma, healing, and the ways that family secrets can damage children who have no control over adult choices that shape their emotional development. The therapy work continues because healing from generational trauma isn't a destination, but an ongoing process of choosing healthier patterns, developing emotional intelligence that previous generations never modeled, and learning to love authentically rather than conditionally. My sobriety is maintained not just through avoiding substances, but through building a life that has meaning beyond personal advancement, relationships based on mutual support rather than competition, and work that contributes to something larger than my own comfort or status. The Harvard degree still hangs on my wall, but it's surrounded now by certifications in cognitive inclusion practices, photos of Neurodiverse Technologies' team achievements, and awards recognizing our company's contributions to accessibility innovation, evidence that success can be redefined through values of service, empathy, and the radical belief that everyone's differences contribute essential perspectives to collective human flourishing. The dead weight I once called Isabella has become the foundation for my own redemption, proving that sometimes the people we wound most deeply can also be our greatest teachers about the difference between success that diminishes others and achievement that elevates everyone, including ourselves.